Well, welcome. This is By the Book, Open Source Reference Implementations of Key SNIA Terminology. My name is Michael Dexter, and I wear a number of hats, one of which is with Gainframe, my own practice, and I do work with a number of clients of various sizes, and I'm also a member of the SNIA DPCO, the Data Protection and Capacity Optimization Group. And with any luck, this will be one of the most unique SNIA talks you ever attend, but I believe it's an important meta topic to address. And based on hallway conversation, there are others of that opinion. This is part of an ongoing journey that began in a data protection BOF at a SNIA event, where members of the DPCO were present, and we got on the topic of best practices and minimum best practices, and one thing led to another with my involvement with the SNIA Dictionary, which if you haven't seen one or grabbed one already, it is one of the most definitive storage dictionaries out there, and the latest edition has just come out. It's a bit heavy in traditional SNIA terminology such as fiber channel, but I've been working with the DPCO to get terms such as OpenZFS related terminology in there and bring it up to date as much as possible. And the managers are very responsive. I believe it's dictionary@snia.org. And if you see something that you feel is dated or inappropriate or needs some attention, just let them know, either with feedback or with specific language. And I found that they're very insightful and responsible in addressing a definition. It's not just throw it over the fence and drop it in. It is genuinely interactive on finding the best words to complete that one sentence, working with a group with remarkable experience. So it's been truly a pleasure. And I went in there hoping to say, well, SNIA defines replication as this, and each time I did that, I found maybe some degree of adjustment needing to it. So it's been a great journey. And again, I encourage all of you to grab the dictionary, use it in your work, and provide feedback. And that led to my participation in the DPCO, and that will hopefully soon result in a white paper on data protection that will be announced probably in the next month or two. Now, the challenge with an industry organization like SNIA is a balance of vendor authority, neutrality, and the fact that many vendors produce de facto standards. The number one that comes to mind is Microsoft SMB. It took a few decades to get some meaningful participation in the community to have those standards opened up under the influence of the EU to help see that through. And in an environment that is so heavy in standards, that shouldn't be a challenge. That should just be natural. It should have been a published spec that they themselves implemented and others implemented compatibility layers with, and on and on. So some of this is just the burden of history, but in an environment like this, and I'll show you with the next slide, where there's some exciting opportunities, humble as they are at the moment. And so naturally, SNIA produces open standards, often very closely with vendors, but sometimes the horse drives the cart, or the cart drives the horse. But each standard has a story behind it, and we all do the best we can. And so, I come from open source circles. That will be very obvious very soon, and the licensing can be key to maximum adoption. The BSD TCP/IP stack out of Berkeley is probably the number one example of how a piece of software that is under a given license can quickly supplant all the others and become essentially a standard all its own. And in doing so, that strict standards adherence from the onset gave us the internet rather than the internet's plural with incompatible sub-regions with extensive translation between them. So here's a visual representation of where SNIA operates. It has its standards that are close to home. There's clearly a very strong industry of open standards, be it the RFCs, be it IEEE, be it you name it. Then, of course, there's open source, which is equally standards-driven and equally chaos-driven. So your mileage may vary in any given goal or attempt to implement a standard, but as I mentioned with that TCP/IP stack, there are ways to have the definitive global, for a certain period of time, standard with a fully open implementation. So right in the middle of those is what I've labeled as this, the convergence of those and the overlap, which is where I operate most, and I'd hope many of you can find interest in operating in that space. So one perfect example, a near perfect example, is the SNIA NDMP work. They worked with a vendor to produce a reference implementation of a SNIA standard. If you're not familiar with the Network Data Management Protocol, that is used by storage devices to have an open protocol for transferring data in and out wholesale, often used by backup solutions, often used for ingestion of new NAS solutions and the like. It is fully open source. It's an implementation, I believe, from Red Hat and another partner. It's under a permissive license, which, like that TCP/IP stack, allows it to show up in the maximum number of locations. And it's freely available. It can be downloaded from snia.org/ndmp. It is by no means the industry standard implementation. It is by no means perhaps perfect in every way, and it's a generation back in its implementation, but it's solid proof that this can be done. And I believe that that type of work is something that, with a little attention from be it the vendors, be it SNIA, be it the individual participants, we can get a lot of value out of. And I work primarily in SOHO to enterprise storage solutions, all open source. And if you take any given product, I'm just pulling vendor NAS out of thin air, and it has its set of features, if you step back, each of those features is in effect an open standard that's implemented. With very few exceptions, is there a truly vendor native, proprietary, open protocol for sharing on your network. Of course, there have been closed solutions at times, and there was a very healthy netware industry once upon a time, but then open standards just set that aside. Now, in stepping back and looking at what is an open implementation and delivered in a product as opposed to a feature off a feature list developed by marketing and implemented by engineering, it shifts the discussion to standards conformance for each of those protocols, and hopefully reference and referenceable implementations, so that when we look at a certain RFC for NFS, if that is based on an open source piece of code, as the industry will demonstrate, a great many vendors will use the same code, and I'll get into some examples of that. Specifically, the non-Microsoft operating systems that dominate storage are FreeBSD, Illumos, and GNU Linux. Products can look very different. They can be delivered in very different ways, be it software as a service, be it a fully integrated solution. But often at the heart of them is the exact same software, and that software is open source. So the successful monetization of those technologies is evidence that they indeed are suitable for this purpose, are proven for this purpose, and as I pointed out at the bottom there, they are enterprise proven. The internet and businesses are running on these technologies. They are making money with these technologies. They are just taken for granted in many circles. I should have thrown in Dexter's law, which is only proprietary software vendors want proprietary software. The end user does not go out of their way to pay money for software. They will absolutely pay for support, without question. They will pay for hardware to run that software on. Software is quite useless without hardware, unless truly virtualized, at which point it still terminates on hardware. So various vendors have their discomfort with sharing in the open. Some do it aggressively, some do it not in our lifetimes. But increasingly, there's a bit of a thaw relating to opening up. And naturally, all of these examples follow the POSIX example. That's the Unix standards laid out long ago. They're slowly moving. They're perfect reference implementations of that standard. Exact conformance to POSIX has been a challenge, given that sometimes those standards are protected by a paywall, which is unfortunate, but clearly open source implementations of Unix and the Unix family have succeeded over the true, proper, paid official representations for the open group and the like. And that's just, again, quirks of history, but I believe also tells the strength of each approach. So, again, about vendors, when you address any given standard, it is hopefully a question of compliance with that standard rather than proprietary extensions to that standard, unless it is very specifically an extensible standard. There are many industries built on extensions to open standards, which is great, but there is very little motivation, in my opinion, to proprietarize an open standard, because often you break your interoperability with other products and create challenges to system administrators and the like. And a great many companies have come and gone trying to gently proprietarize open source software, and generally they have been outperformed by the hundreds or thousands of developers out in the community, and even competing vendors who are willing to embrace the open sort of commons between them, rather than painting themselves into a corner, laughing their way to the bank, and then finding that, well, they've been outpaced by the competition. And so shared code is usually interoperable code. Now, going to buy the book, as per the title, I'm referring to the SNIA Dictionary, and it has been, comprehensive in, say, RAID definitions and fiber channel definitions and the like. So, turning to, for example, any of the RAID definitions, there are very clear implementations in open source software operating systems, such as FreeBSD's GRAID and Linux's MADM. And while it is a bit of a de facto standard rather than open standard, and I think that applies to all of these, OpenZFS out of originally Open Solaris and Illumos is quite unique in that it is quite comprehensive in the various definitions that are covered by it. So even if strictly from an academic perspective of a professor explaining the various definitions in the book, that is one-stop shopping. So if you want to define, explore replication and the rebuilding as per the definition, latency and throughput within the context of the operating system and the rather innovative file system, and you can come to my next talk after this one about various benefits of OpenZFS. You have a one-stop opportunity to educate, which in even the context of limited school budgets and the like and time, that's a very good thing. Continuing, iSCSI's been a very strong open protocol in the storage industry and SNIA, and of course there are open implementations in these sort of leading open source operating systems, from FreeBSD CTL, the Illumos SCSI target mode framework, and GNU Linux Open iSCSI. And if they were to violate the standards, they would do a disservice to themselves as projects and to the users of them. So standards compliance and validation are of great value in those environments. Naturally, NFSD, it's not Unix if it doesn't speak NFS, so that's been a very well proven technology, though NFS v4 has added complexity to an arguably simple, arguably complex solution. Moving on to fiber channel, it has not benefited from the sort of mainstream, be it student, individual developer, SOHO sort of demand that these other implementations have received, but it's certainly out there and it's certainly reasonably well supported. And There are those who generally have never heard of Fibre Channel or who live by it. Not much middle ground there. Hopefully that will change as time goes on. There are various erasure coding implementations. Spacing the name, but I know Backblaze, and there'll be a talk on Backblaze and their adjustments to that erasure coding implementation. I know one of you brought up Ceph, and that gets interesting in this space where, fortunately, with things like Ceph, it might, on one level, be an ad hoc implementation, but it may be also implementing an open, say, S3 implementation, and they've done that in a distributed manner. Minio comes to mind as an implementation of S3 that's available in open source. And with those new distributed file systems, they're not bringing in vendor baggage. They're not bringing in the various legacy challenges I touched on earlier. So those are coming from a generation of developers who, in many cases, only know open source software. That's what they do from, be it school onward. And I think that's very encouraging for all of these things. Naturally, most networking protocols, the portfolio of TCP/IP specifications is open in its documentation, rather good test tools, and of course the implementations. And increasingly, I touch on web accessibility. The W3 organization has set out standards for, say, assisting the visually impaired and making content available suitable for e-readers. And with so many storage solutions having web interfaces, that is very much an important consideration in developing them. Is your web interface compatible with screen readers and other assistance technologies? Now, I very much encourage that as a marketing point, but it's rarely a distinguishing opportunity for proprietarization. It's just the right thing to do. And any and all outreach to the appropriate communities who consume those special interface tools is very good on their part. I haven't looked too deep into compliance tools for content accessibility, but that's where I like seeing vendors operate. Moving on to other sort of storage-oriented terminology defined in the dictionary. I personally have been working on a replication taxonomy. There aren't many out there. And on the surface, there's file and block replication. There are a few de facto utilities, probably none of which are perfect, but they are used each and every minute of every day. And increasingly, as I touched on with Minio and with Ceph, object replication is becoming interesting. It's this new third category that we should each, all pay attention to and think about both the technologies to perform that replication, the validation tools to see that through, and some storage solutions have these all equally available as one-stop shopping. Traditionally, storage solutions have defaulted to block or file, but I think as we expand into unified storage, we're seeing open source technologies that follow along quite well and are very well established in the majority of these subsections. Yes, sir. Question.
And the form that you're working, the replication taxonomy in the SNIA?
Yes, through the SNIA DPCO. Yeah, the feedback has been great. The suggestions on places to look and definitions, be it through vendors and their marketing or through open resources like Wikipedia. I do have a draft of it. I'm more than happy to talk to you about what's missing or not. And I'm going to touch on some of that right now. Here's a hint of exactly that. It's like, so working with, yes, sir, study.
Clarify the difference between a SNIA technical working group and something like DPCO so people understand. Maybe there's some IP implication differences.
As the new guy,
Okay.
you might actually be the best resource to explain that. I mentioned earlier on before you stepped in that this is a bit of a banana peel I stepped on by attending a BOF, and one thing led to another, and here I am with like definitions in the dictionary and working on the white paper, and it's just organically
Sorry,
followed
30
that.
seconds. Just there are different SNIA groups.
Please.
Some of them have IP implications, meaning if you participate, you have a right and an obligation to license any patents you might have. Others, like this, don't. This is more collaborative work on sort of taxonomy and organizing. So it's not doing so much technical work where your patents might be involved.
Okay, our SNIA representative, just for the recording, pointed out that, and that's a tutorials, or what's the different?
No, the difference between a technical working group, which does invoke the IP policy, and DPCO, which is a committee.
Okay, so technical working groups versus committees. The technical working group has an assumption of committing patents as appropriate and working as a fair player there, whereas there are not such restrictions and obligations on the technical committee. However, coming out of open source circles, I assume that participation at all levels. It's just that's what we do. If it's something I am saying before you, it is available to you. It's just that's how I operate. I'm of that generation. So naturally, you've signed up with the Innovation Network. Is it OIN, the Open Innovation Network, a patent sharing group that's a mutual patent portfolio? I just take that for granted. So thank you, SW, for clarifying the role of those. And so working with a client in practice, I mean, if you're discussing replication, understand the problem before you try to solve it. And as we are getting into the unification of storage solutions, of providing block, file, and object services simultaneously, do think about what overlap there is between literally the underlying plumbing to provide that, and ideally the user interface and how that all ties together. I mean, for example, as we drill into the different replication models, there's active versus passive, asynchronous versus synchronous, point in time versus batch, primary backup versus multi-primary, be it a primary server to a secondary, a tertiary, and onward. And in this research, it's been interesting that the database community has sort of defined replication initially, and then the storage industry has sort of picked and chosen what it wants from that, despite the fact that there is a lot to be learned from every implementation, I'd argue. And personally, my effort in open source circles has been with hypervisors. And when looking at replication, what jumps out at me is primary storage, secondary, and tertiary, and the fact that now we're putting databases in virtual machines and saving them to disk and replicating onward. Well, there are so many various buffers participating in that stack that if at least two, be it the database various buffers and the OS virtual machine buffers, aren't all properly flushed, you generally have garbage. And fortunately, the database people understand that really well, more so than every operating systems person I've talked to. So what that means to me is that storage solutions will have hypervisors. They will boot up your virtual machine, perhaps read-only. They will boot your backup. They will do a simple query of that database, perhaps a more extensive integrity check if possible, and verify that your backups are valid, because I've recently heard the term Schrodinger's backup. You don't know if it's valid until you put it into practice. But with online storage being what it is, I see it every day through OpenZFS, you can validate your data from a block level through checksums up through the, shall we say, execution of that backed up data, which I think is a very, very good thing. So talking about eyes on the prize, SNIA has been strong in the linear file system. I don't know if there's an open implementation to coincide with that. Perhaps you can enlighten me, because I did give an example in depth about the NDMP code, which it's imperfect, but it's definitely there. It's properly licensed. It's very much available. So I guess I get a nod that yes, the LTFS is available. What's tape, Grandpa? Excuse me. Naturally, the NDMP code. And swordfish, which is something that's appeared on the scene this last 2 years, perhaps. Do check out the various swordfish talks. I know there are there's the swordfishmockups.com and various example code, but I cannot say if that is a complete open implementation available for download, or if it should be, or if we do need to coordinate and make that happen. But I'm excited about such a technology. And again, do watch for the DPCO data protection white paper that should be out in the next month or two. It was a soft deadline to have it ready for this event, and it's coming along nicely. And let's touch on some calls to action. And based on the conversation, some of it's been rather interactive and exciting, both in the hallway track and here. I come in touch with things like NDMP, OpenZFS, Beehive Hypervisor, and they're all vendor contributions. I can most authoritatively talk about, well, Beehive and OpenZFS, but one came from a storage vendor, the hypervisor, and it arrived to the community with no strings attached, no patent obligations, some developer support from the onset, and those developers have stuck with it despite different hats over the years. And if anything, it's proof that it can be done. And it does meet the needs of the vendor to upstream a certain technology that is not their core technology. And why would a storage vendor have a hypervisor? Well, when you acquire products from other companies, looking at you, Dell EMC, you are faced with a chance to port that technology to your stack, perhaps over 6 to 24 months, or you can drop it in a hypervisor, ideally over a weekend, and spin it up, and the user may not know or care, or it may give you the modularity you need to keep those separate. So in addition to hypervisors and storage providing the validation of your backups and the extension of your storage technology, and as I spoke on Thursday, the regression testing of little bugs within a stack, I think there's a lot of opportunity. There are a lot of opportunities in there. So, as I touched on earlier, there's a broad thaw taking place in vendors and their willingness to participate in various communities with open source software. And I invite you to identify what you're using here and now. If it happens to be open source and it's used throughout your product, if you individually just say thanks to that project with a small donation or otherwise, great. Your experience with that and ability to document corner cases, perhaps, is invaluable to those who may not have encountered your same corner case. So a little information goes a long way when we're discussing complex software stacks that implement open standards and RFCs and the like. So I trust each of you is with a storage vendor to some degree. Show of hands, any? Okay, we've got a few. And I knew this would not be the longest talk, so I've left time for discussion. I very much want to pick up where we left off earlier. I, again, come out of open source circles and just take a lot of this for granted, and that's why I thought it's appropriate to formalize it with a talk and get your feedback to find out, what is SNIA doing right with regard to this, and where are there opportunities? Because naturally, by being here is often a vendor participation that's also assumed, and some are exemplary in this regard. And would anyone like to chime in? Any questions? And I know a few attendees were interested in, say, the NVMe and fabrics and the like, and fortunately operating systems are rapidly getting proper just hardware support, which, as the vendors are a fast-moving train producing the hardware we all use, the projects need to keep up, and they've actually been quite good. And most vendors have been great about their in this last few years, truly warmed up to the fact that it's open source operating systems that are in the data center now. And if you're a network card vendor or a storage vendor, you can't ignore that or else you will perish. So I won't name names, but you know who they are, and they're the biggest names in storage and networking. Any specific questions, ideas, experiences through SNIA of where you've seen it work well? And was anyone involved with the SNIA NDMP effort? Is that...
I would like to comment because I think there's a lot from my company where there has been involvement. I'm just not in that area.
Okay, so your company's been involved, but you're not specifically.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a performance engineer. So
Okay.
we're in the, deep dark secret area. So I guess I'll start talking. I would sort of like to challenge some of your assertions here, because I think that there's still a lot of value in the glue that sort of more traditional proprietary vendors can provide. I can't remember which slide this was, but there's still a lot. I can easily say that what are our products at my company based on? Well, it's a lot of them are Linux based. Mm-hmm. And then there's proprietary glue in there. There's and then there's the open standard part. And I think there's a lot of customers that are looking for the magic glue to hold all the open source together. And I think there are multiple models that work with that. I think the traditional approach is evolving more into an open approach, as you can see with companies like mine. Obviously, there's space for Red Hat and IX systems and companies like that, which are far more open, but still provide that magic glue and support that I think people are looking for. But it's nice because I think when you have the leadership and stuff like MDME and all this fast moving stuff, that there are more open companies leading that effort. I think it's good for SNIA and looking towards standardization because, my opinion is SNIA isn't really leading in standards. It's not leading in implementations and what technology is used. That's decided by the market. That's decided by what are people actually doing. We don't tell people how to implement it, but we come in when the dust has sort of settled down a little and we say, okay, let's make this easier for everyone, easier for vendors and easier for users. And it's nice starting with the open approach because then you don't have the whole SMB thing. Like you mentioned historically, it's been quite a bit.
Briefly to your point, everything I mentioned from the standards perspective are sort of primary technologies, raw technologies, and making them easy is the value add. And I fully endorse that, be it in an open or proprietary way. There are those who are willing to just stay fully open, no matter how painful it is from an administrator's or user's perspective, but clearly that is not for everyone. And that's why how the vendors you mentioned, Red Hat and IX systems, are great examples of. It's like, here are the parts, you can use them all you want, but here's the solution, both hardware and less so hardware with Red Hat, but with partners. Here's how we make it easy at each stage, and fortunately that's modular such that, again, the primary RFCs, unless you have a great example of how your employer is bending standards with unique variations to deliver value?
I don't think that really happens very much. I don't know that we ever really did that.
And why should it? Exactly.
I think historically we've done a lot of this is how, like with SMB, we partnered with Microsoft for a very long time when SMB was CIFS. Right?
Yep.
And we always had a very good implementation, I thought, and that was a real selling point.
Was it your own implementation?
Yeah.
Okay, understandable.
But, now Samba's out there, and Samba kicks butt, and I think they can beat Microsoft in certainly some use cases, at least from some, fun testing I've done, nothing very serious. But, but we're still using our proprietary stack.
Sure.
We put a lot in it, and it's very good in a lot of ways. But we're always sort of chasing Microsoft, and that that's why this event exists in part it seems, because everyone's like, what's Microsoft doing on SMB? Okay, where's some?
Right. Yep.
The two are converging.
You mentioned performance testing. Is that a value add to the customer, or is it an advantage as a vendor? Competitive advantage.
It's hard to say. In my opinion, I think that the customers have changed a little bit, and I believe there seems to be, and please chime in if you think I'm wrong, but I think there has been less interest in standardized performance benchmarking lately.
Less
I think
interest?
Customers are thinking more tactically, maybe, and they're saying, this is my workload, what can you do?
Sure. Niche or use case specific testing?
Yeah.
Oh,
I
fair
think
enough. Absolutely.
That's really come about, and personally, I'm a little biased. I think there's been more standardization in that area, and I think there are good reasons for that.
Okay.
Mostly, and I was telling you this earlier, when you do performance testing, what's the first step that you do? What's the first thing you do?
Call somebody else.
Other than that,
Do it.
First thing is call someone else.
They call the vendor and say, but what's the first thing you do? I argue the first thing you do is you pick your workload generator. And therein lies the problem. Because either the customer comes in and says, I use, just calling it FIO, right? I use FIO for all my testing. You will test this way. The next step is you make a workload.
Right.
I think those steps need to be reversed. I have a BOF later. I'm going to stop talking about that.
Perfect. Do attend that BOF later on testing. Yes,
Your
sir.
point that performance testing is so bespoke that it cannot be standardized in certain fashion. Like it's just one thing test my machine or solution will not. But going back to both of your earlier points, I do not necessarily see a disconnect because I think perhaps what Michael's saying at the possibility of putting words in the mouth.
That's fine.
It's one of those things where standards enable differentiation, right? And it's not necessarily a bad thing when somebody takes a bunch of standards and puts together a larger story in terms of a solution like Red Hat or so on and so forth. So I don't necessarily see the disconnect between you guys and between that stuff.
Oh, no, I think that we just acknowledged that there are the two different approaches. And I'm at work for a more proprietary vendor, although that's evolving. I see Michael's points and think, okay, you're saying my approach isn't really that great, but it is. I mean, I think
didn't say that.
I think EMC donated something to open source that's in PNFS.
Okay. Yes. PNFS. I believe so.
NFS v4.
Yep.
And I don't know how the licensing or anything works. I'm an NFS v3 by personally being into performance. And I'll allow anyone to challenge me about that. I'm sure there's an NFS v4 performance discussion that we could have. I think more and more things are evolving to where the proprietary stuff is the glue, and then the vendor chooses how proprietary it is. But you can see, Dell EMC has been very active in the shortfish stuff, and I'm hoping that will be reflected more and more in our product as we go along.
So for the recording, Dell EMC has been active in SNIA Swordfish, which is great news. I saw a hand in back.
Yeah, I can
Please.
comment. I'm sorry I missed your presentation. I can comment on a couple of historical perspectives.
Of course.
You mentioned NDMP. That was primarily sort of a donation after a lot of people had already implemented it. They didn't want it to go away. SNIA was perceived as being a place that would still continue to exist. So they just kind of did a dump on SNIA. There was no particular technical work in SNIA, but SNIA provides a home and a repository and sort of the IT structure to enable that to continue. Those of you who don't know, SW Worth, I co-chair SDC since 2008, so blame me if you don't like some of the content. So that one was sort of almost an archaeological thing for a while, and then there's been some renewed interest. Another example, you said LTFS, the inventor, IBM Research, said, okay, great, we've got tape and we can do this. There is, the LT would lead believe that maybe this works on LTO tapes. It obviously does, but it works on more than that. There's some high-end tapes from Oracle Storage Tech and IBM. They're not LTO, so LTO as the marketing organization didn't particularly want to be promoting LTFS. SNIA, actually, I introduced IBM to HP and Oracle and said, why don't we get, IBM really wanted to open source it, but they wanted to standardize it first, and then they wanted to open source a reference implementation. They wanted to standardize it because their customers said, we're not going to do a lock-in with you. We like the idea of a tape-based file system, but we will not do something that we can only have a single vendor. IBM said, great, let's standardize it. We brought together all of the tape designers and vendors in SNIA, developed the standard, and now we're on Rev, I don't know, 2.x something. There are reference implementations. There they particularly did it so they said, here's a single tape drive file system, the magic sauce to enable that to bridge across multiple tapes or work with libraries. The vendors still kept to themselves, and that's fine. That works very, very well. And then there were some surprising things about it. A few years ago, a guy named Albert Chen, who was working at Western Digital at the time, came along in Storage Developer Conference and said, hey, look, we've implemented LTFS on the new SMR disk drives because they look a lot more like a tape drive than they do a traditional, and kind of the smack to the forehead, and people go, oh, that's pretty cool. And so there was some innovative stuff that perhaps escaped some of the boundaries that the vendors had initially thought about. But it's there, it's available. I commented earlier, SNIA doesn't guarantee that SNIA is not open source in the sense that there is an assumption of transfer of patents.
Sure.
The people who own the patents still have their rights to license the patents. SNIA has an IP policy that is what's called RAND, reasonable and non-discriminatory. And in general, patents are for lawyers and not for engineers. But if you get involved in a technical working group, you need to know this. So SNIA tries to be very friendly to this stuff. We appreciate the efforts that Michael and other people are doing. And if you look, there is a way to sort of, if you participate, you get the rights and obligations. But we have a long history of this. I'll say one more thing. Storage Developer Conference actually sort of evolved with, sort of out of or next to the old CIFS conference, and then absorbed it. So this year is the 25th anniversary of Samba. It's the 20th anniversary of Storage Developer Conference. And in fact, downstairs there's the big CIFS SMB, SMB2, SMB3 plug fest that's been going on for many years. For a few years, Microsoft didn't participate. There was a lot of headbanging there. And at the time, in 2007, 2008, I worked for Microsoft. So we brought Microsoft back in. That's really revitalized that plug fest. So even though that's an open specification because all the documentation is available, it's not patent-free and it's not open source, but Samba and others implement it. EMC Dell, by reason of sort of accrual, has, I think, 3, 4, maybe 5 different implementations of SFP around from various developers, including what's arguably one of the best enterprise implementations, but not open source. The Samba guys are there, very, very happy to talk to you if you want to implement. And for other people that don't like Samba-style GPL3 licensing, there's at least 2 or 3 separate independent vendors down there who will be happy to license you the code and do an implementation. So SNIA is a big tent for all of this. There's a whole wide variety of people who are hardcore open source, no patent stuff, on over to proprietary, let's keep it, but we want to have good reference implementations so our customers are okay, sorry, it's your talk and not mine.
That's okay. I appreciate your input there. I hope some of that was recorded by the recording. And just to clarify with the example of LTFS, who was driving the desire to avoid vendor lock-in?
The customers.
The customers. Okay, that's a very good point. And
by the way, that was, IBM said the customers won't buy it if it's only IBM as a supplier. So it's very much in IBM's interest to bring it to SNIA, to standardize it so that other people could and did implement it.
that's worth repeating. IBM said that its customers did not want LTFS to have vendor lock-in. Well, Every technology we're discussing, short of the hobbyist working in their basement, is generally driven by a customer with needs and money. And they should be in the driver's seat in all of this. So do speak up as a consumer of these technologies. Back to Dexter's law, only proprietary software vendors want proprietary software. The end user wants a solution, regardless of what shape it comes in. Any final questions? I cordially invite you to see my next talk in this room about combating ransomware at the block level. Thank you very much.